Hi, my name is Melissa Recks with FWC's Division of Marine Fisheries Management, and I'm going to talk to you today about spotted sea trout. We're in the process of gathering public feedback on the status of the sea trout fishery around the state of Florida, and this presentation is a presentation that we're giving at public workshops at 12 different locations around the state. And we wanted to also provide this presentation for you online in case you weren't able to make any of our in-person public workshops. So I'll start with a quick outline of what this presentation is going to cover today. And the beginning of that is going to be a quick overview on the biology and the fishery here for spotted sea trout. Then I'll present you with some stock assessment results and some of the public feedback we received before we started these presentations. And then I'll explain to you how you can provide input and what kind of input we're looking for from people today. And then a little bit about where we go from here, what we call our next steps. So why are we doing this? Why are we talking about sea trout? Spotted sea trout is among the most popular fisheries, inshore fisheries particularly, for recreational fishermen here in the state of Florida. And it's one of our management success stories. Previously, it was overfished back in the 70s and 80s. We'll talk about that a little bit when I get to the stock assessment results. But we've seen that fishery rebuild the last few decades. However, we have heard some concerns from fishermen in various parts of the state about the status of the fishery locally for them where they fish. And so we have asked our institute to provide us with a stock assessment. That was completed this year. And now we're coming to you guys to hear what you think about the fishery and how your experience with the fishery has been. Our goals for this workshop and for the feedback that we're going to get from you is to share with you the results of the stock assessment, to gather some of your perspective on the status of the fishery, and then get some feedback about our management of the spotted sea trout fishery. So a little bit about spotted sea trout biology. They live about 8 or 9 years. They grow really quickly. The females grow quicker and get bigger than the males do. The fish reach as much as 11 or 13 inches total length in their first year of life. The females start to spawn at size 12 to 16 inches. And the adults spawn almost entirely in our estuaries and bays. That spawning is kind of a long spawning period. It goes through the spring, summer, and fall. And those fish that are spawned in the estuaries usually stay there in the estuary where they're born. Because of this, because the local nature of these fish, the fact that they stay where they're born, we have ended up with multiple genetic stocks of these fish in various locations around the state. So I'll spend a minute to talk about our current regulations. Most of the spotted sea trout fishermen probably know this, but just to cover it. The allowable gear for this fish is hook and line or cast nets. And then the rest of the regulations vary a little bit depending on where you're fishing and what kind of fishing you're doing. So the recreational fishery statewide has a slot limit of 15 to 20 inches, and there is an allowance for fishermen to keep one fish over 20 inches each day within their bag limit. The bag limit, however, changes depending on where you're fishing. We do have 4 management zones for sea trout, and the bag limit varies depending on which zone you're in. In the northeastern portion of the state, the bag limit is 6 sea trout per day. In the northwest portion of the state, it's 5 per person per day. And then in the southern portion of the state, in the southwest and southeast management zones, the recreational bag limit is 4. The commercial size limit is different from recreational, but it's the same for all commercial fishermen statewide. That slot limit is 15 to 24 inches. The trip limit for a commercial fisherman is 75 fish per day. And if you have more than one commercial fisherman fishing from the same boat, they collectively can harvest up to 150 fish from that boat per day. There are no closed seasons recreationally, but we do have closed seasons for the commercial fishery. And those vary depending on where the fishermen are fishing. In the northeast portion of the state, the commercial fishery is open from June through November. In the northwest and southwest portion of the state, so all along the Gulf Coast, the commercial fishery is open June through October. And in the southeast portion of the state, the commercial fishery is open May through September. Our regulations do apply in federal waters, which may seem counterintuitive since this is an estuarine fishery, but it does close any enforcement loopholes that we might encounter by having our regulations applied no matter where you're fishing off the state of Florida. All right, so now I'll move into talking about the stock assessment. This particular stock assessment that was recently completed includes data through 2015. So the data that I'll talk about for the purposes of the assessment goes through 2015. And the purpose of the stock assessment is to evaluate the status of the stock relative to our management goal. And the management goal for spotted sea trout here in Florida is 35% SPR. So what does that mean? This slide shows a little bit of a picture of what our management goal looks like, but let me start by explaining what SPR is. SPR stands for spawning potential ratio, and the spawning potential ratio is simply, like it sounds, a ratio. It's a ratio between how much weight there is of fish, mature adult fish, out there in the population today compared to what there would be if no one was fishing. So it's just a ratio of how much fishing has reduced the biomass or the weight of adult fish in the population. So that's important to keep in mind because spawning potential ratio, as we're going to talk about it today, really only applies to what effect fishing has on how many fish are in the population. So it doesn't account for things like that are environmental, that aren't associated with fishing. So things like red tide or loss of habitat or cold kills that might affect how many fish are in the water aren't accounted for in SPR. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at these results. But our management goal for sea trout is 35% SPR. So we are managing to have at least 35% the amount of fish or the weight of fish in the water today as we would have if absolutely no one was fishing. If you look at the graphic on the slide, the 35% is shown at the top. You'll also see another threshold that's called the biological threshold, and that's 20%. The reason that I'm showing you that is to know that it's at 20% that we start worrying about the sustainability of the fish. So unless we drop below 20% SPR, we don't really have to worry about whether or not this fishery is sustainable or whether or not sea trout are producing enough eggs or enough baby fish to maintain that population moving forward. So the 35% gives us a 15% cushion relative to any sort of biological concerns. So we're already building a management cushion in there for things like I talked about earlier, things like cold kills, red tides, habitat loss. So some of that is figured into our management goal. So this is basically the results of the stock assessment here. And again, you'll see that this is the 2017 stock assessment, and these graphs show each of the 4 management zones and breaks the assessment results out for each zone. So the important thing to remember is that there's a dotted line across the middle. That's our management goal of 35% SPR. And the black line that you're seeing relative to that is what the stock assessment estimates the SPR was at any point in time over the history of the stock assessment, which goes back to 1950. So you're seeing results from 1950 through 2015. What you'll see is that the fishery in both the Northwest and the Northeast management zones back in the 70s and 80s did dip below that 35% SPR. And that's when we consider the fishery to have been overfished. And you'll see that throughout the state, in all 4 management zones, since that time, since the 90s, the fishery has been above our management goal, and we've been exceeding our management goal for this fishery statewide. So that's really great news. And you'll see that where the line ends in 2015, that in all 4 management zones, we were exceeding our management goal, our management expectation of 35%. So that's the great news. We don't have concerns about the sustainability of this fishery, and we don't have concerns that we're not meeting our own management goals. So that is really what the stock assessment tells us. That doesn't mean that fishermen in any particular location, though, are experiencing the fishery the way they want to experience it. So that's why we want to talk to you guys. So a little bit more about this fishery, where the harvest comes from, and who's doing it. This graph shows roughly the last 10 years, from 2007 through 2016. And the green bars are the recreational harvest. The dark blue bars at the top are the commercial harvest. And you'll see, it's easy to see that over the last 10 years, this fishery has been heavily dominated by the recreational fishermen. In fact, approximately 98% of the total harvest of sea trout statewide comes from the recreational fishery, with about 2% coming from our commercial fishery. So I'll talk just for a minute about the recreational fishery in general. This graph is the last 10 years again, and on average, the recreational fishery takes about 1.7 million spotted sea trout each year statewide. The interesting thing that you might not realize is that 85% of that recreational fishery comes from the Gulf Coast. So the majority of it comes from the coast, and this graph shows that. It's a little bit of a complicated graph if you're not used to looking at it. What you'll see is the medium blue bars, or the medium blue color along the bottom of the graph, represents the Northwest management zone, and then the other management zones are stacked upon that in different colors. So you'll see that the medium blue zone, the medium blue Northwest zone, and then the Southwest on top of that make up about 85% of the recreational harvest over the last 10 years. One of the things that folks have talked to us about before we did the stock assessment was whether or not we should continue to allow people to harvest fish over the slot. So we wanted to look at that information and bring that to you. We did find that the percentage of the harvest from the recreational fishery that comes from fish over the slot limit, fish more than 20 inches, changes depending on which side of the state you're on. On the Atlantic coast, about 9% of the recreational harvest is of fish that are larger than 20 inches, and on the Gulf Coast, it's only about 3%. So either way, it's a fairly small proportion of the fishery, but we do think that there might be more over the slot fish, relatively speaking, being harvested on the Atlantic coast. So I'll move to the commercial fishery. Again, just a reminder that the commercial fishery only takes about 2% of the total harvest now, over the last 10 years. But you can tell by the graph on the left that the commercial fishery historically, in the 1950s through the 1980s, took a much higher number of fish. So we've seen that the commercial fishery very stable now at a much lower level of harvest than they had in the far past, and that the recent years, it is, like I said, at 2% total harvest. It also depends on where in the state you are, how much of the fishery comes from the commercial fishery. So again, 2% statewide, but it varies within each zone. And what you'll see from the graph on the right is that the dark blue bars, which represent southeast Florida, make up the vast majority of the catch in the commercial fishery. So now I'm going to go through each management zone. I'll start in the western portion of the state and wrap around and talk about where we are in the state and kind of some trends in the fishery that we've seen over time depending on which zone you're in. So I'll start with the Northwest Management Zone. This goes from far west Florida through basically Pasco County. The boundary is at the Fred Howard Park Causeway near Pasco. So all of the Panhandle and the Big Bend are in the Northwest Management Zone. This zone on its own accounts for 50% of the statewide harvest. If you've ever fished in that part of the state, you probably understand why. Lots of seagrass in the Big Bend, really good habitat for sea trout. The graph that's shown on this slide is the total recreational catch, which includes both released fish and harvested fish. The gray bars are the fish that were released. The green bars at the bottom are the fish that were actually harvested by the fishermen. And you can see that the recreational landings, those green bars, are variable over time, but no alarming trends. Though variable, fairly stable. We do estimate that about 18% of the fish caught in this portion of the state are actually harvested and that the rest are released. The other thing that I'm going to talk about as I go through each of these management zones is our fishery independent monitoring data. So when I show you landings data, we're showing you information that's associated with the actual fishery. We also do research that is scientists going out and doing research completely independent of what the fishermen do. And that's the fishery independent monitoring or fishery independent data that I'll talk about within each of these management zones. The reason, or part of the reason that we do this, is that it gives us a measure of abundance in the various estuaries that are surveyed by this research program. And we typically have two different ways or two different groups of fish that we're looking at. We'll look at what are called young of the year fish. These are baby fish that are less than a year old. And that gives us a measure of how many new fish are coming into the fishery every year. And then we'll also look at adults. So for the baby fish or the young of the year in the Northwest Management Zone, we do see patterns oftentimes when we look at this data. And what we see in the Northwest Management Zone for sea trout is that we had what we call a weak year class, or not as many baby fish as we normally see. So we had a weak year class in 2013, but then in 2014 and 2015, we saw a rebound and we saw more of those baby fish being caught in the estuary than in the previous year. So that's just some natural variability that you would see, and that might explain some of the variability that fishermen see in subsequent years based on how many baby fish were coming into the fishery. Adults, on the other hand, in the Northwest Management Zone, were fairly cyclical. We just tend to see kind of this natural variation in the number of adults over time. We did have a lower abundance of adults in this zone in 2013. So that's kind of the story for the Northwest Management Zone. And I'll move down the coast to the Southwest Management Zone. So that boundary goes to the Monroe, Miami-Dade County line. That portion of the state accounts for about 36% of the statewide harvest. And you'll see again the same graph that I showed you for the last zone, where the gray bars are recreationally caught fish that were released, and the green bars at the bottom are those recreationally caught fish that were harvested. You'll see for the Southwest Management Zone that the recreational landings are variable, but pretty stable over time. There's some natural ups and downs, but we don't see any long-term trends. We do think that in this portion of the state, about 10% of the fish that are caught are actually harvested. The fishery independent data that we have for the Southwest Management Zone shows that we don't have as many baby fish or young of the year fish coming in each year as we did in the 90s. So in the 90s, we were seeing regularly a higher number of baby fish coming in. But over the last 10 years, it's been fairly stable, and we had a little bit of an increase in 2015. The adults, on the other hand, we had high abundance of adults, relatively speaking, in 2008 through 2010. And that was currently above average for the time series. So wrapping around to the east coast of Florida, the Southeast Management Zone really covers the vast majority of the east coast when you look at it on a map. It includes Miami-Dade all the way up through Volusia County, so it encompasses all of the Indian River Lagoon and then what we traditionally think of as Southeast Florida. While it's a very large space, it doesn't take near as many of the fish as we see on the Gulf Coast, and we average about 9% of the statewide sea trout harvest in the Southeast Management Zone. The recreational landings in this part of the state are cyclical. However, we have seen, and you can see it on the graph that's shown, that lower landings in recent years than maybe some previous years, but we tend to see this cycle, and it's not necessarily alarming to see in recent years that we've had lower harvest than other portions of the time series. We do think that the percentage of fish kept in this part of the state varies, anywhere from 5 to 13% depending on the year. And as I said, the total catch, which is not just the amount harvested, but all the fish that were caught by the recreational fishery, has been lower in recent years than some of the previous years. The fishery independent research from this part of the state has shown relatively stable numbers of baby fish coming into the fishery over the last 15 years, but we did have strong year classes, or lots of baby fish, in 2009 and 2015, as well as back in 2006. With respect to the adults in this portion of the state, we did have a lower average abundance in 2013, but we've started to see those numbers rebound, and they were up in 2014 and 2015. So the last portion of the state is the Northeast Management Zone. This is just 4 counties, so it's that upper northeast portion of the state of Flagler through Nassau counties. And that portion of the state only averages about 7% of the statewide harvest. And we've seen an increasing trend in the recreational catch over the last 10 years in that portion of the state. It was down in 2015, but except for 2015, we've seen that catch increase. And you can see that on the graph. Again, the gray bars are released fish, and the green bars are fish that were harvested by the recreational fishery. The percentage of the fish that are kept in that state also varies depending on the year, but it can be as high as 20%. The fishery independent research from the Northeast Management Zone shows that we had relatively few baby fish compared to other years in 2010, 2013, 2014, and 2015. So we've had some years recently where we had weak year classes or fewer numbers of baby fish coming into the fishery. The adults, on the other hand, have also been lower than the average in 2013 and 2015, but we are starting to see an increasing trend. All right, so now I'm going to move on in the presentation and talk a little bit about what we've heard from fishermen and other stakeholders around the state leading up to these presentations. Some of the concerns we heard from folks in different parts of the state was that they had seen localized declines. So in the specific areas where they fished, some folks are reporting that they're seeing fewer sea trout. Some folks have expressed concern about the number of the spawning fish, the big adult spawning fish that we're taking out of the water, and have suggested that maybe perhaps we shouldn't be allowing harvest of fish over the slot. We've also heard some concerns about commercial harvest. Some folks believe that maybe we need to tighten down or be more restrictive on the commercial fishery. And we've heard a lot of concerns about habitat and water quality and what impacts that might have on our sea trout populations. Some of the suggestions that folks have brought to us because of their concerns is that they would like us to think about maybe modifying the size limit. That could be eliminating harvest of fish over the slot, so no more harvest of fish over 20 inches. Some folks have talked about maybe just changing the slot limit, either shifting it down so that we're harvesting smaller fish, or making the range of the slot smaller. So instead of taking fish 15 to 20 inches, it's some smaller gap of 15 to 19 inches or some other narrowing of that slot limit. Other things that folks have suggested we might want to consider include reducing the recreational bag limit, reducing or eliminating commercial harvest, or eliminating bag limits for guides. One of the things that people have told us in recent years is that they don't think that a charter captain who's out on a guide trip, who's actually got clients paying to take him out, should be able to harvest a bag limit. So one thing that folks have asked us to consider is eliminating the bag limit for guides and charter captains who are on a for-hire trip. In this case, we're talking specifically for sea trout. So now we're coming to you, and we'd like to hear your feedback. That's why we're doing this presentation, and that's why we're reaching out to folks around the state. In summary, we know that the 2017 stock assessment that I told you about earlier indicates that the populations are healthy, but we also know that many stakeholders have expressed concerns in recent years and have some suggestions for management changes. So this is your opportunity to participate in input and tell us what you think about the fishery. Specifically, what we want to know is the quality of the fishery in recent years. Where you fish, does the quality meet your standards and your expectations? Is it a high quality fishery? And then tell me, if it's not, tell me what it is that makes a high quality fishery for you. So we want to know a little bit about your desired fishing experience. Do you want to have a high catch rate? Do you want to catch big fish? Is it most important to you to be able to bring these fish home for dinner, and so you want to catch keeper size fish? And then in general, just regulatory feedback about the actual regulations. So again, I'm going to put this slide here just so you can kind of see exactly what we're asking you for. We want to know the current quality of the fishery, where you fish. So if you're going to give us some feedback, we'd love to hear where you fish, as well as what you think of the status of the fishery, what your desired fishing experience is. That's some of the things I just mentioned. Or if there's some other measure of what makes a great day for you when you go out sea trout fishing. And then particularly some of the management suggestions that people have brought forward, we'd love for you to comment on those. Basically, if this fishery isn't meeting your desired fishing experience, what regulatory changes are you willing to deal with in order to get that fishery back where you want it to be? So some of those things might be, don't change anything. I'm happy with the sea trout fishery, and I don't want to see any regulatory changes. That would be the status quo. So that's one thing that you could tell us. You could also tell us that you're willing to tolerate size limit changes or bag limit changes in order to get this fishery back to where you think it should be when you go fishing. And then specifically, if you are interested in bag limit changes, is that specifically for the recreational fishery or the commercial fishery? Or do you feel strongly one way or another about whether a charter captain or a guide on a for-hire trip should be allowed to keep their own bag limit? And that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to tell you today. I will tell you a little bit about where we go from here. This slide shows all of the towns that we've been in for public workshops. These are all completed. You can see the dates and the locations. However, the next big step is to go to our commission. So the FWC Commission meets in Okeechobee on September 27th and 28th, and we'll be going to that meeting and taking the results of all the feedback we've heard at the public workshops and from people like yourself who've commented online or given us a call or sent us an email. We'll take all that information to our commission and ask for their direction about whether or not they would like to consider changing the regulations for this fishery. So if you're available to come to Okeechobee in September, we'd love to have you there. It's an opportunity to speak directly to the commissioners who make the decisions about this fishery. But also know that we'll be there to give the feedback that you've given us. So in closing, we'd love to hear your feedback, and if you'd like to do so, I'd encourage you to come to the FWC website, and that website that you're looking for is myfwc.com/saltwater comments. You can go to that website and provide your comments on sea trout or any other fishery here in the state of Florida, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.